winter. And then we'll talk about the outlooks further into spring and summer for kind of all the range of conditions from temperatures to precipitation to drought, floods, and everything in between. So let's go ahead and start with our winter temperatures. I have two images on the screen. The left image is from the winter of 2017 and 18, last winter, and then this winter is on the right, 2018 and 19. And the areas in green are below normal temperatures, the areas in orange are above normal, and the areas in gray are near normal. These images come from the Midwest Regional Climate Center at the University of Illinois. And so what it shows is for the northern plains, the Great Lakes, the northern Rockies, it was another cold winter like last winter, but even a little bit colder in that period of late January and February, which led to a lot of deep frost conditions of several feet in the upper Midwest northern plains, as well as a lot of ice formation in the rivers and all of that. And so when you get deep frost conditions, it does lead to excessive runoff potential from snowmelt as well as future rainfall. You'll notice further to the east and south, a little bit warmer winter across, say, the middle Atlantic into the southeastern U.S. and Florida, with temperatures running several degrees Fahrenheit above normal. And then out in the southwestern U.S. and the western U.S., it's been colder this winter than last winter. So really the setup is the western half and the northern third of the U.S. has been colder than average for the most part. And really the warmth this winter has been contained over the southeast, say, quarter of the U.S. But that also, by the way, sets up the active weather pattern coming in from California across the south and then up into the Ohio and Tennessee River valleys. Going on to the next image is winter precipitation departure from average. And one of the big things here that stands out is last winter we did have some wetness in the upper Missouri Basin and Montana, as well as over portions of the lower Mississippi Valley into the Ohio-Tennessee Valley and portions of the northeastern U.S. But you'll see a lot of the western plains into the Rockies, the western U.S., California, Oregon, below normal precipitation. Anything basically yellows, golds, oranges, reds, is all below normal. The big thing on the right that you will see is the coverage of wetness this winter. It really pushes the extremes. Our National Center for Environmental Information, part of NOAA, recorded that this winter is the wettest on record since 1895 for the country. And really outside of, say, parts of New Mexico and West Texas, and then little dots here and there, a little bit of the Pacific Northwest, Western Washington, Northwest Oregon, little places like southern lower Michigan. But for the most part, precipitation's been at or above normal across a wide swath of the U.S., with the greatest above normal precipitation ranging from California, Nevada, across Utah, and then into parts of western Colorado, and then, of course, across a good portion of the northern plains, on into the upper Midwest, western Great Lakes, as well as the mid and lower Mississippi Valley, into the Tennessee, Cumberland, Ohio valleys, and even into the middle Atlantic states. Similar conditions this winter in the Northeast, but again, the main message is it's wet across much of the country this winter. And that does make us vulnerable as we go into the spring. Going on to the next slide is the winter snowfall that has occurred so far. And the big message is, again, the left image is last winter, the right image is this winter. Above normal snowfall across much of the north and west, except for, say, places like Montana and small pockets of California. It's kind of the opposite this winter versus last winter, a lot more snow. Further to the east and south, it's not been that. We've had more warm rain systems in the east versus snow systems this winter. The Ohio Valley is about normal snowfall. The Northeast is close to normal, maybe a little bit below normal, but definitely less than last winter in the Northeast. And definitely in the southern U.S., not much snow to speak of this winter, unlike last winter where some snow did occur. The reality is, this all started really January. December wasn't too active in the snow regime, but definitely January and February really got active across the northern and western U.S. So what does that all translate into our soil moisture conditions? On this next slide, you will see the soil moisture rank in percentile. Really, east of the Mississippi River, we're generally ranking in the 90th to 99th percentile, basically meaning we're in the top 10%, if not top 1% of wetness. All of that dark green area and portions of the Great Lakes into the central plains of Nebraska, Kansas, and say western Iowa, then also down into portions of the lower Mississippi Valley, into the Ohio Valley, and into the middle Atlantic. That's all in the 99th percentile. Even the western U.S. has gotten in on the wetness across California, Nevada, Utah, and portions of Arizona. The lower left image there is last winter, basically, during the winter. And so you'll see a lot more dryness last winter in the west. That dryness is now really confined to a little bit of the Pacific Northwest. So again, much of the country, the wet conditions from precipitation have translated into wet soil moisture conditions. I will say that because of the cold weather in the northern U.S., that again is translated into a lot of frozen ground. And some of that frozen ground has now been releasing gradually in portions of the lower Missouri Valley. But there's still a lot in the Great Lakes, into the upper Midwest, northern plains. And so that wet soil condition is locked into the ground already. And then you add in all of the above normal snowfall on top of that. So that's going to make for a wet spring in terms of soil conditions across the northern U.S., especially in portions of the corn and soybean regions. I will say too is I look back at previous years, and it was hard to find a year with this expansiveness in terms of wetness. Some years that kind of looked like this year were 1948-49 as well as 1949 and 50. But it's not surprising with so much of the country ranking in the top 10 percentile that it's hard to find a lot of years that look like this. Because of all the wetness then, looking at the drought monitor, the big image on this next slide here is the current drought conditions across the U.S. as of last week. Really, east of the Rockies, not very much drought. It's mainly confined to leftover dryness in portions of the central and southern Rockies into West Texas, and some in the Pacific Northwest as well, especially in Oregon. And you'll notice in the small lower left image, a lot less coverage this year than last year at this time. So we definitely are on the wetter side. Moving on to the next slide, in terms of USGS stream flow conditions, all of that wetness is translated into above normal stream flows across a good portion of the central and eastern U.S. Anything in green is considered near normal conditions by the U.S. Geological Survey. Anything in blue, dark blue, black is all well above normal. There's definitely some below normal stream flow in the Pacific Northwest, with above normal stream flow in California down into Arizona. The area in the northern plains there that's in white into Minnesota, and that is basically where there's still iced up areas that aren't reporting really stream flow conditions. They usually don't report that, why they have iced over rivers. So you've definitely seen in the news and that with some of the ice jams that ice is moving in portions of the Missouri Basin with the flooding that's ongoing in the Missouri, as well as portions of the upper Mississippi, but there's still iced over conditions in the upper Midwest into the northern Rockies. I did want to show in the next few slides what's coming up. And the area circled on this next image is the current conditions. That's over the U.S. This image may look a little confusing with lots of different things going on. That's basically our weather pattern in the upper levels of the atmosphere. But the main thing is every little dip is a storm system. And so we have one right now over the central U.S. It's a weak system in the central U.S. at this time. Further to the west, off the west coast of the U.S., there is a stronger storm system that is approaching the west coast. There is a ridge of high pressure in southwest Canada that's in that white area, and that will help to drive that storm system underneath that southwest Canadian ridge, and that means that we're having an active pattern. But what I wanted to really highlight is if you look out into the Pacific, and there is all those lines are pointing to storm systems. So we have a series of storm systems that are lined up all the way across the Pacific Ocean, meaning that we have an active weather pattern that goes all the way back to Japan. And if I go to the next slide, this is 1 week from now. And that storm system off the west coast winds up by then into the eastern U.S. And we have another more significant storm system approaching the west coast yet again, with additional storm systems backed up into the central Pacific, as well as all the way back to that final red line pointing out by Japan in that area with another storm system. So the parade of storm systems is lined up. So we have a very active weather pattern coming up. And if we look into early April, that storm system that was near the west coast, that winds up in the Great Lakes in the eastern U.S., and there's another storm moving into the western U.S., and there's still bigger storms backed up all the way to Japan again. And so the message I wanted to convey is that there's nothing that's really indicating that the active pattern that has brought wet conditions to a good portion of the U.S. This winter is going to change, at least into the start of the spring growing and planting season. So with that, I will transition into our official National Weather Service Climate Prediction Center outlooks. And these will be being updated by the Climate Prediction Center. I believe that is coming up Thursday. It'll be coming up on Thursday that they'll be released. But what we're looking at is with that active pattern, temperatures in the orange areas are expected to be above normal. And in those white areas in the central U.S., they're called equal chances, basically meaning it may wind up a little bit above, below, or near normal. Confidence is a lot less in that area. There's uncertainty. But the bottom line is for temperatures, the west and east coast probably will be on the warmer side. And if anything, the central U.S. would be leaning towards either normal or maybe a little bit on the colder side as we go into the start of spring. One of the factors, too, that should be pointed out is that with the significant snowpack over the Great Lakes and Northern Plains areas, that area, that's also going to be a factor in how fast we can warm up, as well as the Great Lakes have significantly above normal ice cover. They're not at record levels. But again, that means that those water temperatures of the Great Lakes will be influencing the weather pattern. And a lot of times that weather pattern can be influenced from, say, New England all the way back into the Northern Plains, because the Great Lakes can change the storm system track and upper level patterns. And so it has a far reaching effect across portions of the north central and to the northeastern U.S. The one area that's probably most likely to see the warmth will be in the southeastern U.S. With above normal temperatures there, so probably a little bit of an early spring green up will continue in that area and be shifting to the north maybe a little bit faster than normal over the east central southeastern U.S. In terms of precipitation, that active jet stream that I showed you, for the most part, the Climate Prediction Center of NOAA is forecasting basically at or above normal precipitation across most of the contiguous 48 states. So they do have a little bit of below normal showing in the Pacific Northwest, but really for the most part, we're expecting at or above normal precipitation. That's with that active jet stream. This outlook here goes all the way through June. So this is the April, May, and June outlook here. And that's what I'm referring to as the spring outlook for rainfall. Because of that wetness that's forecast to continue into spring, we're expecting really very little drought across the U.S., at least during the spring period. And we may see some continued improvement of those small drought areas that are in the Rockies, stretching back into portions of Oregon. So really not a lot of drought to speak of as we have in the recent past years. If anything, wet planting conditions probably is more likely discussion as we go into the springtime across the U.S. In terms of flood potential then for the spring, This is our long-range river flood risk map. There's a link at the bottom. This is at least a 50% chance of reaching certain categories. Within the National Weather Service, we define those as minor in orange, moderate in red, and major flooding in purple. This is not our current forecast for current conditions, but this is the potential based on future rainfall and also the melting of all the snowpack across the northern U.S. And so certainly in the central U.S., that is our main flood risk, especially in portions of the Red River of the North Basin into the upper Mississippi, as well as we already know that there's ongoing significant flooding in the Missouri Basin. And some additional significant flooding is expected there. And that significant flooding will translate all the way down into the lower Mississippi Basin. So certainly agricultural areas that plant along the floodplains of the Mississippi drainage system in the central U.S., including portions of the Missouri, the Ohio, all of those areas will be vulnerable to potentially late planting because of the above normal flood risk in the central U.S. this spring. Looks like more of a normal flood risk for western and eastern U.S. areas overall. And finally, I'm going to move into, well, before we take questions, I'm going to move into the summer outlook from our Climate Prediction Center. And what it's suggesting is above normal temperatures across a good portion of the country. I will say soil moisture, especially east of the Rocky Mountains where we have deeper soils. Soil moisture will play into that. It's not uncommon to see 30 to 50% of your summer precipitation east of the Rockies fall from evaporating off that moisture. And so that may also influence temperatures. That's why you'll see that white area of equal chances in the north central U.S. that could inhibit in portions of the central U.S. How much we warm up. It also may make for a more humid summer east of the Rockies especially. And so that's important because as we've seen in the past a little bit, that may mean we have a more of a summer, even if we have above normal temperatures, it may be more on nighttime low temperatures, minimum temperatures, which play into growing conditions, where daytime highs may be more normal or barely above normal, where nighttime lows are well above normal, versus saying that we're not expecting like really high temperatures, like 95 to 105 kind of stuff. So certainly with our wet soil conditions, that could play out. In terms of summer precipitation outlook on the next slide, some below normal precipitation is forecast in the western U.S. to develop during the summer months. In this case, this will be July, August, and into early September. But precipitation remaining most likely at or above normal east of the Rockies, especially east of the Mississippi Basin. So that's kind of so really the trend is your friend to a point here at this time. And finally, I wanted to show one thing that often comes up on this last slide, and that is the temperature and precipitation trends since 1976 observed across the U.S. And there's a winter, spring, summer, and autumn image. And within that image, you'll see, like in winter, you'll see a temperature is on top, precipitation then would be below it in the greens and that color. And so what I want to highlight is most of the warming that's gone on over the U.S. has gone on in the winter months, but also in the western U.S., really in all months of the year, but the greatest warming has gone on in the winter time. In terms of wetness, you'll see kind of more of a scattering across the U.S. in terms of that, but definitely late summer into autumn, a lot of the basically harvest season for a lot of the crops, corn, soybean, those kind of crops. Definitely we have seen wetting up in the late summer into autumn. And that's been a challenge. I know here in the eastern Ohio Valley, portions of the eastern Midwest, that's definitely been a challenge over the last 10 years because a lot of the wetting up that has gone on during the late summer into fall time. So with that, I will gladly turn it back to Abby, and I'll gladly answer any questions. But I will say this is definitely, In summary, because of the wet conditions, we are vulnerable to these storm systems in the Pacific Ocean. We can't forecast day-to-day weather much beyond about 7 to 10 days. And so we can give you these general trends of what we're thinking is coming up over the next several months into summertime. But it'll all come down to the individual storm systems and exactly where they go, how strong they are, how many they are. But certainly with the wet soil conditions across a good portion of the U.S., the risk for some issues is there, especially on the wet side as we go into the spring planting and growing season.
Thank you, Jim. The first question comes from Barbara Sachs, and she asks that in the Northeast, specifically in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut last year, during the summer there was a great deal of moisture, which led to fungi on lawns and other plants. Does it look like this is something that might happen this coming growing season?
Yeah, based on the outlooks of precipitation continuing to be at or above normal by our Climate Prediction Center into the summertime, combined with temperatures being forecast, so let me go back to that, of above normal, certainly you definitely always run that risk of enhanced issues with that. So yeah, I would say that it still looks like that risk is there. Because it's not been quite as wet in some of those areas, it may not be as much as last year, but I would think that risk is still there, yes.
All right. And Becky Koch in North Dakota did say just that Fargo is starting to produce sandbags next week, which I guess kind of led me to Eden started as a result of the 1993 floods, and some of what we're seeing out of Nebraska looks very, very similar. Is there any similarities in the projection? I mean, kind of a 26 years later?
Well, yeah, each year, basically, when it comes to like flood season, each year is different. You could probably find some similarities to like 93, some similarities to 1965, some, like I said, in terms of soil conditions, 1948, 49, 1949, 50, but it's really, those are just setup or antecedent conditions. It really will come down to how these storm systems that are coming across the Pacific Ocean interact. For example, all of the snowpack that still is on the ground with the water content in that snow across the northern plains into the upper Midwest and Great Lakes. Sometimes there's a chance with where you can gradually melt that off. But the one risk is the longer you keep that snowpack into April, you run the risk of an individual storm coming along that gives you a more intense, rapid warm-up just because the sun angle is up. We're getting later into spring then. And so if we can't get rid of that snowpack over the next week or two, then that risk increases that you'll get a rapid melt-off at some point, and that enhances that flood risk further. So there is some uncertainty there, and yes, we can draw some similarities to some of these past years, but the bottom line is what we're looking at is we look at it more as how do we rank in terms of percentiles, and certainly we're in the top like 10 percentile for current conditions and the risk there.
Thank you. Encourage anyone that has questions to go ahead and type those into this chat pod. Give it a couple more minutes. We have another question. With the cold staying around longer, does that mean that we'll have a higher risk of tornadoes or more severe tornadoes this season?
That depends. Since tornadoes are driven by more than just cold weather, it's the combination of you need to mix the right amount of dry air with the moisture. Usually it's the dry air off like the Rockies with the moisture coming off the Gulf of Mexico and the cold air coming from Canada. So it'll depend on individual storm systems. Certainly our jet stream and weather pattern is active and looks to remain active. So there's certainly risk there. It's just hard to say of how much that will be.
Thank you. And Ken Hellevang, also in North Dakota, shared a link in the chat pod that all of you can find, and it is the national snow analysis that kind of shows the snow water, or the amount of snow and water that the northern folks are receiving right now. It's a lovely shades of pink and purple.
Right, and we work with our National Operational Hydrologic Remote Sensing Center out of Chanhassen, and that information we definitely utilize into our soil moisture and hydrologic river models and that. And there is certainly a lot. It ranks in portions of the northern plains and upper Midwest. There's definitely in the top 10 percentile. There's some big water amounts in that snow. Not every year do you get equal amounts of water. Sometimes you might have 2 feet of snow on the ground with only an inch of water in it. Sometimes you get maybe 3 or 4 inches of water in that snowpack. So we definitely have a dense snowpack this year in the northern U.S. That's going to lead to a lot of questions going into the spring in terms of, you have a dense snowpack, you have wet ground. The soil temperatures will probably be lagging some for, well into the planting season across the northern U.S. Due to that, either the snowpack and or the wet ground, because if you have dry ground, it heats up faster. So there's definitely going to be a risk to planting this spring from the wet side of things.
Great. Thank you. Do we have any other questions that have been submitted? What is the impact of higher levees and swift snowmelt on lower Mississippi planting activities?
So basically, within the how things work is that in the National Weather Service, we make forecasts, and then the USGS measures the river levels, and the Army Corps of Engineers manages that. In terms of levees, many of the levees have been there for a long time, and they're designed to protect areas that are vulnerable. I don't know what else to say about that. I mean, they're there for a reason. So, they're designed to be there for good reasons.
Thank you. With moist soils, will the rapidity or rate of thawing of the snows make a difference this spring?
Could you repeat that one, Abby? I didn't quite catch that one.
With moist soils, will the rapidity or rate of thawing of the snows make a difference this spring?
Yeah, I mean, so we have, since you have a snowpack that's very dense in the portions of the northern and western U.S. I know that like a lot, we even saw that in the Ohio basin for a while, further to the east, but you develop basically ice at the bottom of it from the repeated freezing and thawing, and that makes it harder to get rid of that bottom last, say, inch or two of snow because it's not equal. And also, on one hand, that snowpack protects from your frost depth getting too significant, but we had a problem back in January with some of the early big cold outbreaks across the U.S. where our ground was in many areas got exposed, and so we were able to take some of those near record and record cold temperatures that came down in January and early February and freeze the ground deep. And then we put a lot more of the snow on top of it. So in essence, we've locked in that frozen ground in some of those areas to the north. And so it's going to take longer for that frozen ground to come out. as well as that it helps to enhance runoff because your ground is frozen in those northern areas, and or in many areas it's wet, and so the water can't really go down into the soils as much. So as the snow melts, we get much more runoff, and then when you get rain on it, you continue to get runoff. So it inhibits temperatures, it enhances runoff, it changes everything. So certainly this winter's above normal snowfall is going to play a role into spring conditions, and certainly the soil moisture conditions. Once you get into the evapotranspiration season, will enhance that feedback mechanism where then that wet soil feeds back into the atmosphere for rainfall as well.
Thank you. The next question is, why aren't our water management structures like Army Corps dams minimizing some of these flooding water conditions?
So it depends on where you're talking about. So for example, we've seen tremendous mitigation of flooding in, say, the Cumberland and Tennessee Valley this winter, where we probably would have seen record crests that they were able to hold that water back and then later release that water. That's what they've been doing. We work closely with them, and they've done a very good job. Further to the west, if you're talking about like the Missouri Basin, one of the things is a lot of the big projects are further upstream of where some of that snowpack fell. And so they haven't been impacted that much from the heavy snow in parts of Montana and, say, the western Dakotas as much as further to the south and east. So the whole thing is the precipitation has to fall where flood control projects are. And where they are, the Army Corps of Engineers does an excellent job of actually mitigating and holding that water back and reducing flood levels. But Mother Nature is controlling everything, and it's wherever the precipitation falls. And so sometimes you get the precipitation, snow, rain to fall behind big flood control projects, and other times you don't. And that's just kind of the luck of the draw sometimes.
Thank you. Our next question is, you mentioned the soil saturation and temperature affecting planting, but how do you see those conditions affecting harvests?
Again, that'll play out. It'll depend on how everything grows, because of course, in the corn and soybean belt, for example, if your crops come up later, the USDA is a much better expert at this than I am, but I sit on a bunch of ag calls with different extension agencies, universities, and certainly how those crops respond, and then how hot we get this summer will play a role into how delayed things are and how things grow. Certainly, the climate trends have been for during harvest season wetter than normal conditions, but that's much more by that time of the year, much more in the central and eastern U.S., much more driven by return flow around the Bermuda high pressure system off the East Coast, and how any tropical systems translate into the eastern U.S., or sometimes tropical systems come off of the eastern Pacific up into the Baja of California into the southwestern U.S. as well. But by the time we get to late summer and fall, it's much more driven by other features going on. So that's more of a wait and see on that one as we get more into the springtime to see how that all plays out.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions coming in? All right. Do you have any closing thoughts or things you'd still like to mention, Jim?
Yeah, I think it's very important to pay attention to the changing conditions, just because we are vulnerable going into this spring. Every year we are, of course, but since we have wet soil conditions, still lingering snowpack in the northern U.S., we do have the active jet stream. So I would encourage everybody to to monitor later forecasts and that. And that's at weather.gov, just weather.gov. Because things will change. Our climate outlooks will be updated this Thursday from the Climate Prediction Center of NOAA as well. So but it is important. Things are always changing. All these outlooks, beyond say 7 to 10 days, those are just general kind of general trends that we're seeing or could potentially happen, but it'll really come down to those individual weather systems and how strong they are. Like we saw the big storm last week from Colorado up through Nebraska. That was, one of the strongest on record in a long time out in that part of the country, depending on which state you were in, near record or record low pressure system there. So each individual storm will drive the weather as we go over the next few months. So just stay on top of things, because what you hear, general outlooks, they can manifest themselves as expected, or sometimes they can change. So just weather.gov would be, I think, important to stay up on over the next 1 to 2 months.
Great. I would like to thank Jim for taking time out. Oh, we have one more question. Do you see a 10 or 20-year trend on these changes?
You can really look. There's a lot of cycles that you can find within the data, depending on where you look. I know in the Great Lakes, we saw like a 10 to 20 year cycle in terms of record low water levels for the Great Lakes, and now we're in what appears to be a 10 or 20 year cycle for very high water levels for the Great Lakes. Other parts of the country, I've seen cycles that you can see. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes there's longer cycles as well. We saw, for example, really I was doing some research on cyclone frequency across the United States. And really from about 1900 to 1950 or 60, we had a big up cycle. And then from about 1950, 60 range to about 1980, we had a down cycle. And then since then, we've had an up cycle again. So there's 30 to 50 year cycles as well. So there's a lot of different cycles in the data for a whole host of reasons. But certainly, yes, I've seen that. We've seen that in the Great Lakes a little bit.
All right. Again, I would like to thank Jim for his presentation today. If anyone has questions, I'll go ahead and leave the chat pod open for a few more minutes after we stop the recording, and we can email those to Jim to get your answers back. To all the participants on today's webinar, please keep an eye out in your email. You'll be receiving an evaluation link to go to an online survey and complete an evaluation for us. And I would like to remind everyone that the next webinar as part of the professional development series is scheduled for April 16th. It's at 2 p.m. Eastern as well. And that one is entitled Fatty Funds, an Overview, an in-depth look at Purdue's 4-year proposal. So that will be actually taking a look at what was proposed and what's anticipated to be kind of funded as part of that Fatty Funds over the 4 years. Keep an eye out in your email. The registration link for that should come out within a week or so as we start promotions for April's webinar. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and drop those in the chat pod so we can get those emailed to Jim for him to answer. And I appreciate everyone taking time out of your day, and specifically Jim, thank you for presenting, and thank you to all of those that asked questions. I greatly appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you next month.